The Christmas Eve Murder, the case of Dylan Thomas and William Bush. On Christmas Eve 2023, in the quiet, historic Cardiff suburb of Llandaff, Wales, a tragedy unfolded that would shatter multiple families and raise profound questions about mental illness, friendship, and the terrible consequences when warning signs go unheeded. This is the story of William Bush, a young man with everything to live for, and Dylan Thomas, the childhood friend who took his life in an attack of shocking brutality. This case is not about the famous Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, who died in 1953. This is about a different Dylan Thomas, a young man born on June 30, 2000, who would become known to the world under the most tragic of circumstances. What makes this case particularly haunting is that it involves two best friends, young men who had known each other since they were 13 years old, sharing a home, sharing their lives, right up until the moment one killed the other. William Bush, known to friends and family as Will, was 23 years old when he died. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must first understand who he was. Will was described by those who knew him as compassionate, loving, witty, and vibrant. He was the kind of person who could light up a room with what his sister called his cheeky grin and quick-witted humor. Will was a talented athlete, a passionate golfer who had played for his country. Those who knew him spoke of a young man who spent much of his free time on the golf course with his brother, Alex. He was sporty and outgoing, with a large circle of friends who would later describe him as loyal, funny, caring, and trusting. These were not empty platitudes offered after death. They were the genuine characteristics of a young man who had navigated the challenges of early adulthood with grace and determination. After graduating from university, Will had secured a position as a business rates surveyor. It was not a glamorous job, but it was a solid start to a career. However, about 2 months before his death, Will experienced health difficulties, suffering from migraines and nausea. He made the decision to leave his job and spent about a month on sick leave. Rather than viewing this as a setback, Will saw it as an opportunity. He was planning to start a new, less stressful job in the new year. He was described in court as someone who had recovered from setbacks and whose life was decidedly, quote, on the up. Most importantly, Will was in love. His girlfriend, Ella Jeffries, was planning a future with him. They were looking forward to finding a place of their own where they could live together. Will Bush was not just surviving. He was thriving. He had plans, dreams, and a bright future ahead of him. On Christmas Eve 2023, Will was getting ready to return to his family home in Brecon to spend the holiday with his parents, John and Sharon, his sister Katrin, and his brother Alex. It was supposed to be a joyful reunion. Instead, it became the day that would forever change the Bush family's understanding of what loss truly means. Dylan Thomas came from a very different background. He was the grandson of Sir Stanley Thomas, a Welsh business tycoon whose empire included Peter's Savoury Products, the company behind Peter's Pies. The Thomas family fortune was estimated to be worth approximately £230 million. Dylan was, by birthright, heir to a considerable fortune. Yet, as the trial would later reveal, material wealth did not translate to emotional security or mental stability. Dylan's childhood was marked by his parents' separation when he was young. There were allegations of domestic violence in his early life. Court testimony revealed that Dylan's relationship with some members of his family was characterized as distant. His father split his time between Jersey and Dubai. His mother lived in Sussex. A police liaison officer's note suggested that Dylan felt deserted by most of his family, though this characterization was disputed during the trial. Dylan was described as a quiet, reserved young man, immature for his years. His grandmother, Sharon Burton, who would play an unwitting role in the tragedy to come, described him as calm, never loud or confrontational. She said she had never known him to be violent. To the outside world, Dylan appeared to be an inoffensive young man from a privileged background. But beneath this surface, something was profoundly wrong. Dylan's girlfriend at the time described him as being into some very weird things. He talked about the Illuminati. He believed he could solve the energy crisis. He had delusions of grandeur that would later be recognized as symptoms of severe mental illness. He had even reached out to Elon Musk with claims of creating revolutionary technologies. As the prosecution would later argue, despite having everything in life materially, Dylan Thomas had achieved very little. While William Bush, coming from more modest Ian's, had achieved great success in his personal life and was building a future, Dylan's life was characterized as being on a downward spiral. The two young men had been friends since they were about 13 years old, having met at Christ College Brecon, a private boarding and day school in mid-Wales. The school charges approximately £13,000 per year in fees. It was an environment of privilege, where lifelong friendships were meant to be forged. Beginning around September 2021, after Will finished university, the two friends moved in together at a house called Ty Matthew on Chapel Street in Llandaff, Cardiff. The house was owned by Dylan's grandparents. For over 2 years they lived as housemates, navigating the challenges and companionship of young men starting their adult lives. The arrangement seemed to work. When Will was employed, he paid Dylan rent. When Will lost his job due to his health issues, Dylan waived the rent requirement. Will frequently helped Dylan by taking on much of the responsibility for looking after Dylan's dog Bruce. On the surface, it appeared to be a mutually supportive friendship. But as Ella Jeffries would later testify, there were troubling undercurrents. Dylan had made disturbing comments that revealed a dark turn in his thinking. In November 2023, just weeks before the murder, an incident occurred that should have served as a red flag. Dylan Thomas attempted to break into Buckingham Palace. He tried to scale a 14-foot fence outside the royal residence. When apprehended by police, he told officers he was looking for energy fields between the palace and Cleopatra's Needle, an obelisk in central London. He was rugby tackled by an officer. After being detained, he told them, "I'm over now, so you may as well show me round." This was not the behavior of a rational person. This was a young man experiencing what would later be identified as psychotic delusions. He was arrested for this incident, yet he was released. Looking back, this was a moment when intervention might have prevented the tragedy to come. Dr. Panchu Xavier, a consultant forensic psychiatrist at Ashworth High Secure Hospital, who would later examine Dylan, testified that this incident at Buckingham Palace was a clear sign of psychosis. He stated that the explanation Dylan gave, that he was exploring the energy field, should have prompted further questions and mental health evaluation. The fact that Dylan was articulate and well-dressed have led authorities to underestimate the severity of his condition. Dr. Xavier noted that superficially, someone in the acute phase of psychotic illness can seem quite plausible, and it takes focused questioning to reveal the true diagnosis. Even more chilling was an incident that occurred in October or November 2023. William Bush told his girlfriend Ella that Dylan had said to him, "I thought or wondered about killing you." These were not idle words. Will took them seriously. That night, he barricaded his bedroom door to prevent Dylan from entering while he was asleep. He was frightened. Think about that for a moment. A young man in his own home felt the need to barricade himself in his room because his housemate and supposed best friend had expressed thoughts of killing him. Will confided this fear to his girlfriend, but it's unclear whether he told anyone else or sought help. Perhaps he hoped it was just Dylan's odd sense of humor. Perhaps he didn't want to believe his friend was capable of such a thing. Perhaps he felt trapped, living in a house owned by Dylan's family. There was also an incident at a clothing store where Dylan believed he had been assaulted. Rather than seek medical attention, he went to a solicitor in an attempt to sue the store. Dr. Xavier later testified this was another example of Dylan's deteriorating mental state and paranoid thinking. According to Dr. Xavier's testimony, Dylan had been experiencing signs of psychosis for up to 6 months before the attack. This would encompass the Buckingham Palace incident and the threats made to Will. Dylan had at least one hallucination, believing that Will had threatened to drink his spinal fluid. This bizarre and frightening delusion speaks to the severity of Dylan's break from reality. Yet, despite these warning signs, Dylan Thomas remained at large, untreated, living with his best friend in Llandaff. On the evening of December 23, 2023, both young men were making their separate plans for Christmas. William Bush was planning to spend the evening with his girlfriend, Ella, before traveling to Brecon to spend Christmas with his family. It was meant to be a happy time, a time of celebration and togetherness. Dylan Thomas, meanwhile, went to stay with his grandmother, Sharon Burton, at her home in Roos in the Vale of Glamorgan. This was not a planned visit. During the evening, Dylan told his grandmother that he was lonely and depressed. Sharon, concerned for her grandson, told him, "You're coming down with me then for a while." Dylan agreed. What Sharon Burton could not have known was what was going on inside Dylan's mind. Police examination of his phone records would later reveal a deeply disturbing pattern of internet searches. On the morning of December 23rd, Dylan had been searching for information indicative of suicidal feelings. As the day progressed, his searches took a darker turn. Just after midnight on Christmas Eve, around 12:41 a.m., Dylan conducted internet searches on his computer. He searched for the anatomy of the neck. He searched for information about veins and arteries. He looked up information about assisted suicide. These were not casual searches. These were focused, purposeful inquiries into how to kill. While conducting these searches, Dylan was also engaged in a Snapchat conversation with William Bush. The text messages have not been fully disclosed to the public, but court testimony confirmed that Dylan and Will were texting back and forth into the early hours of the morning. Dylan asked Will if he had left a key for him. At 11:04 p.m., Will responded, "Yeah, sorry lad, only just seen my phone. I'm here still." The juxtaposition is chilling. Dylan was texting his friend while simultaneously researching how to kill. The prosecution would later argue this demonstrated clear, premeditated intent. The defense would argue it showed a confused, psychotic mind spiraling out of control. At 3:31 a.m., Dylan attempted to book an Uber to take him from his grandmother's house in Roos back to Llandaff. The booking failed. Unable to get immediate transport, Dylan eventually went to sleep, but his plan was already forming. The text conversation between Dylan and Will resumed around 11 a.m. on Christmas Eve, December 24, 2023. Dylan texted Will asking what time he was leaving. Will replied that he was leaving a bit later on, mate. Dylan then said he needed to speak to Will before he left. Will agreed to stay and wait. Dylan told his grandmother that he needed to go back to the house in Llandaff. His stated reason was that he wanted to walk his dog, Bruce. Sharon Burton, being a caring grandmother, agreed to drive him. She had no reason to suspect what was actually going to happen. During the journey, Sharon noticed Dylan's leg was jumping. She asked him what was wrong, why he was wound up. Dylan said nothing was wrong, but Sharon sensed something. As she would later tell police, "There was something, but I don't know what." Dylan texted Will, "Okay, nearly home, stay there X." That simple message, ending with an X for a kiss, would be the last text message William Bush ever received from his friend. At 10:41 a.m., Sharon Burton's car arrived outside Ty Matthew on Chapel Street in Llandaff. Dylan told his grandmother to wait in the car. He would just pop in quickly to check on the dog. Sharon parked outside and waited, having no idea that her grandson was about to commit murder. What happened inside that house on Chapel Street has been pieced together through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the accounts of those who heard the screams. Dylan Thomas entered the house carrying a kitchen knife. He went upstairs to Will's bedroom. The attack began there. Dylan stabbed William Bush multiple times in the bedroom. Will, realizing the mortal danger he was in, tried to flee. He ran from his bedroom, down the stairs of the three-story house. Dylan chased him. The assault continued as Will tried desperately to escape, to get out of the house, to get help. The neighbors on Chapel Street, going about their Christmas Eve morning preparations, heard sounds they would never forget. Multiple witnesses described hearing screams of horror. These were not ordinary screams. They were the sounds, witnesses said, that one might hear in a horror film when something terrible is happening. The attack lasted approximately 7 minutes. In that time, Dylan Thomas stabbed William Bush 37 times. 37 separate wounds. 16 of those wounds were to the front and back of Will's neck. The prosecution described it as a, quote, frenzied attack. The forensic evidence showed stab wounds to Will's neck, chest, head, and back. Both of his lungs were damaged. The most lethal wound was to Will's throat. Dylan cut Will's throat, severing the major artery in his neck. As the prosecution's barrister, Greg Bull KC, told the court, "It is clear that Dylan Thomas used the kitchen knife to stab Mr. Bush in the chest and cut his throat, severing the major artery in the neck, as a result of which Mr. Bush bled to death. William Bush, 23 years old, died on the patio outside the house on Chapel Street. The young man, who should have been sitting down to Christmas Eve dinner with his family in Brecon, lay bleeding to death in the winter cold of Cardiff." Sharon Burton was still sitting in her car, waiting for her grandson to walk the dog. The next thing she knew, Dylan was banging on her car window. He was covered in blood. As Sharon later told police, he was so distraught, he looked as white as the shirt he was wearing. Sharon jumped out of the car. She took the car keys and ran to the house. She could see Will on the floor. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. This caring grandmother, who had simply driven her grandson to walk his dog, was now confronted with the body of a young man her grandson had just murdered. Sharon Burton did what she could. She pushed past Dylan and began administering CPR to William Bush on the patio. She was praying he would be okay, but as she later said, "I felt in my heart he's dead, but was praying he was going to be okay. I couldn't stop." She handed Dylan her phone and told him to call emergency services. Dylan called 999, the UK equivalent of 911. But when he spoke to the operator, he lied. He accused Will of stabbing him. He claimed he was the victim. Witnesses in a nearby car park had also heard the screams. They called the police. Emergency services arrived at Chapel Street quickly, but there was nothing they could do. William Bush was pronounced dead at the scene. Dylan Thomas was arrested on the spot. He was covered in his friend's blood, standing at the scene of the crime he had just committed. In the police footage taken shortly after his arrest, Dylan can be heard making paranoid statements. He asked the officer to keep an eye on the police in his house, claiming the last time he interacted with police, they had tried to plant coke on me. He told the arresting officers, "It was self-defense, mate. He was coming at me, and I stabbed him back." He said Will had been going, quote, "psycho" for months, and that he had been telling Will to leave the house. These were lies. The forensic evidence would prove beyond doubt that Dylan had been the aggressor, that he had initiated the attack in Will's own bedroom. Sharon Burton, traumatized beyond measure, later told police, "I just wished I had never taken him there. I never envisaged anything like that with Dylan, because he's such a quiet, reserved boy." While most families in Wales were gathering for Christmas Eve celebrations, the Bush family received a knock on their door. It was not Will arriving for dinner as expected. It was officers from Dyfed Powys Police, there to deliver news that would destroy their world. Will's father, John Bush, would later tell Cardiff Crown Court that the lives of his family changed overnight when his son died, and the effects would stay with them forever. In his victim impact statement, John said, quote, "is the main victim here. Those simple words carry profound weight." In the midst of all the discussion about Dylan Thomas's mental state, about legal definitions and psychiatric evaluations, it was important to remember, Will was the main victim. Will's sister, Katrin Bush, spoke on behalf of herself and her brother Alex at the sentencing hearing. Her words painted a picture of a family utterly destroyed. "I cannot put into words how traumatic and awful this experience was, and I still have intense moments of panic when I think about this," she said. "Myself and Alex cannot begin to comprehend the fear and suffering that Will endured on that day. We are truly haunted from the horror of it, and this will live with us forever." She described Will's death as a, quote, "barbaric crime." The family statement, read in court, expressed their anguish. "We cannot even begin to comprehend the fear and suffering that Will endured on Christmas Eve last year, and we will have to live with hurt, grief, anger, and upset for the rest of our lives." Will's girlfriend, Ella Jeffries, also provided a victim impact statement. She and Will had been planning their future together, looking for a flat where they could start their life as a couple. Instead of planning a wedding or a life together, She was left to grieve a future that would never come. The Bush family's statement to the court was clear in their assessment of Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas is an evil, manipulative liar. Throughout this process, we have seen no evidence of any remorse or taking responsibility for his actions that day. We can only hope that he will never be released back into the community. The family found the legal process incredibly distressing. Will's parents found it too utterly unbearable to attend any of the trial. They could not sit in that courtroom and listen to the details of how their son died, could not face the person who had killed him. The family also found it incredibly difficult that the process focused heavily on Dylan Thomas and his mental state. As they noted, he was the person who had planned and murdered their beloved Will, and had taken away his voice and bright future. Dylan Thomas was charged with murder. From the beginning, he admitted killing William Bush. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and there was no question that Dylan had caused Will's death. The legal question became, was it murder, or was it manslaughter? Or, in the British legal system, murder requires proof of intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. Manslaughter, particularly manslaughter by diminished responsibility, can be argued when the defendant was suffering from an abnormality of mind that substantially impaired their mental responsibility for their actions. Dylan Thomas pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He denied murder. This plea set the stage for a trial that would hinge on the question of Dylan's mental state at the time of the killing. The trial took place at Cardiff Crown Court in November 2024, nearly a year after the killing. Dylan appeared via video link from Ashworth High Secure Hospital in Liverpool, where he had been held since his arrest. He had been receiving treatment for schizophrenia for the 11 months leading up to the trial. He wore a black jumper and had close-cut black hair. He sat with his hands clasped in front of him on his lap, watching the proceedings that would determine whether he would be convicted of murder or the lesser charge of manslaughter. The trial was presided over by Mrs. Justice Karen Stein. The prosecution was led by Greg Bull KC, assisted by Mr. Wright. The defense was led by Orlando Pownall KC. The prosecution accepted that Dylan Thomas was mentally unwell. They accepted that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, they argued that mental illness alone did not preclude him from being guilty of murder. Their case rested on several key points. First, the evidence of premeditation. Dylan had searched for information about the anatomy of the neck in the hours before the attack. He had looked up veins and arteries. These searches, the prosecution argued, showed clear thinking and planning. As Greg Bull told the jury, Dylan had demonstrated clear thinking before the attack. Second, the nature of the attack itself. 37 stab wounds, 21 to the neck alone. The severing of the major artery. These wounds, the prosecution argued, showed an intention to kill. The attack was not a brief loss of control. It was sustained, brutal, and thorough. Will was stabbed in his bedroom, then chased down the stairs, then stabbed repeatedly until he died. Third, the absence of certain symptoms. This was crucial. The prosecution presented evidence from their own psychiatric expert, Dr. Jaya Wickrama. He testified that while Dylan had schizophrenia, the illness was unlikely to have caused a substantial impairment in Dylan's ability to understand the nature of his conduct, to form a rational judgment, or to exercise self-control. Critically, this was not a case where Dylan was hearing voices telling him to kill. As Greg Bull told the court, "This is not a case of the death being caused by voices. I was told to do this by some voice, a spirit, by my dead ancestors." The prosecution also presented a possible motive, though they acknowledged it was speculative. Greg Bull painted a picture of two young men whose lives were diverging. Despite having everything in life, Dylan Thomas had achieved very little, he told the jury. Whereas on the other side of the coin, Mr. Bush, having come from very little, achieved great success in his personal life. Everything in his life was on the up, where it might have been perceived in Dylan Thomas' case. Life was on the downward spiral. There may have been feelings of loneliness or resentment. The defense had questioned whether the trigger might have been Will's plans to move out and find a flat with his girlfriend, Ella. But, as Mr. Bull noted, only two people can tell you if there might have been a motive. One of them is dead, and the other, for reasons known to you, has not been able to give evidence, so don't speculate. Dylan Thomas did not testify at his trial. He remained in Ashworth High Secure Hospital and participated only via video link. The jury did not hear directly from him about what happened or why. The defense, led by Orlando Pownall KC, argued that the only explanation for Dylan's actions was his severe mental illness. Their key witness was Dr. Panchu Xavier, the consultant forensic psychiatrist at Ashworth Hospital who had been treating Dylan. Dr. Xavier testified that Dylan had been experiencing a psychotic episode during the attack and had been showing signs of psychosis for up to 6 months before the event. This period would include the Buckingham Palace incident and the threats made to Will. Crucially, Dr. Xavier testified that in Dylan's psychotic state, he had come to believe that Will posed a threat to him. "My view is that he was convinced he was going to come to harm," Dr. Xavier told the court. "If that is what you think, you are going to try to eliminate that threat." In his mind, that's why he behaved as he did. He felt threatened by his best friend, and that's why he responded as he did. The defense argued that there was a quote of signs demonstrating psychosis. They pointed to the bizarre internet searches, not just for anatomy, but for methods of overdosing and assisted suicide. These searches, they argued, showed a mind in chaos, not a mind engaged in rational planning. Orlando Pownall posed a question to the jury. Why would a young, inoffensive man take his grandmother to his address, intent on slaughtering his best friend? The implication was clear. Only severe mental illness could explain such an act. "There is a whole gamut of signs demonstrating psychosis," he told the jury. "The prosecution says the fact that he was schizophrenic is irrelevant. We submit that it wasn't." The defense also addressed the issue of premeditation. Mr. Pownall argued that the suggestion that a sudden considered loss of temper could have nothing to do with his mental state is untenable. The internet searches, he suggested, were not evidence of planning, but evidence of a disturbed psychotic mind. It's important to note what the defense was not arguing. They were not claiming self-defense. As Mr. Pownall made clear, it was not in dispute that Dylan had initiated the attack. He had not acted in self-defense. Will had not attacked him. The defense's argument was about diminished responsibility. They were asking the jury to find that Dylan's schizophrenia had so substantially impaired his mental responsibility that he should be convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter rather than murder. Our Dr. Xavier also testified about missed opportunities for intervention. He noted that after the Buckingham Palace incident, someone should have recognized Dylan's mental state and provided treatment. Unfortunately, that might have been the first time when an intervention could have happened that may have prevented him continuing to be unwell, he said. He added that Dylan's articulate nature and appearance may have led clinicians to underestimate his condition. He also told the jury that it would not have been obvious to a layperson that Dylan was psychotic. This explained why Sharon Burton, why Will, why others in Dylan's life had not fully grasped the severity of his condition. After hearing all the evidence, the psychiatric testimony, the forensic reports, and the victim impact statements, the jury retired to deliberate. The question before them was complex. Did Dylan Thomas, despite his schizophrenia, have the mental capacity to form the intent to murder, or was his mental illness so severe that it diminished his responsibility to the point where manslaughter was the appropriate conviction? On Thursday, November 21, 2024, the jury returned their verdict. They found Dylan Thomas guilty of murder. The jury had clearly been convinced by the prosecution's case. They accepted Dr. Jayawikrama's testimony over Dr. Xavier's. They found that while Dylan was mentally ill, his schizophrenia did not substantially impair his ability to understand what he was doing or to exercise self-control. The internet searches for the anatomy of the neck, the planning involved in getting back to the house, the sustained nature of the attack. All of this pointed to a man who knew what he was doing and intended to kill his friend. The verdict meant that Dylan Thomas would face a mandatory life sentence. The only question remaining was what the minimum term would be before he could be considered for parole. Dylan Thomas appeared via video link from Ashworth Hospital for his sentencing on Friday, January 24, 2025. He had now spent 11 months in the psychiatric facility, receiving treatment for his schizophrenia. The sentencing hearing began with the reading of victim impact statements. Katrin Bush and Ella Jeffries bravely read their own statements to the court. Their words painted a devastating picture of loss, trauma, and grief that would never fully heal. Mrs. Justice Karen Steen then delivered her sentencing remarks. She began by acknowledging the magnitude of the crime. "You took a son away from his mother and father," she told Dylan Thomas. "You bereaved the woman he loved, with whom he was planning his future. You deprived his sister and brother of their young brother." She spoke of Will's character and potential. "He did well at school and at university. He was a passionate sportsman and gifted golfer who played for his country, and he and Ella were planning for a future together." She emphasized the totality of the harm. "The taking of a life is a terrible thing, not only because of the life which is cut cruelly short, but because of all the other lives which are damaged as well. But, as his father said, Will is the main victim here. He was only 23, senselessly murdered and deprived of many, many decades of happy and fulfilling life." Justice Stein then addressed the factors she had to consider in determining the minimum term. She noted the aggravating factors: the vulnerability of the victim, who was in his own home when attacked, the sustained nature of the attack, the use of a knife, and the injuries inflicted, orally to the neck. She acknowledged the mitigating factors as well. Dylan had no previous convictions. His age, 23 at the time of the offense, was a mitigating factor. Most significantly, she addressed his mental health condition. Justice Stein explained that she had heard evidence from 2 psychiatrists. Dr. Xavier had testified that all 4 criteria for diminished responsibility were met. However, Dr. Jayawikrama's opinion was that the final 2 criteria were not met. His evidence was that Dylan's schizophrenia was unlikely to have caused a substantial impairment in his ability to understand the nature of his conduct, to form a rational judgment, or to exercise self-control, and he was unable to conclude that it provided a clear explanation for Dylan's conduct. "It is plain that the jury preferred the evidence of Dr. Jayawikrama," Justice Stein said. Nevertheless, she gave Dylan some credit for his mental health condition in determining the sentence. She also noted that while Dylan's family and friends were not best placed to appreciate that he was suffering from a mental health disorder, this did not reduce the minimum term further. After weighing all the aggravating and mitigating factors, Justice Steen pronounced sentence. She told Dylan Thomas to stand. "Dylan Thomas, for the murder of William Bush, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Taking account of all the relevant circumstances and the aggravating and mitigating factors that I have set out, the minimum term I impose is one of 17 years and 337 days, imprisonment. That is a minimum term of 19 years, imprisonment minus the 393 days that you have spent in custody, on remand pending trial." She then said simply, "Mr. Thomas, you will go now to begin your sentence." Dylan Thomas, age 24, was led away to begin a life sentence. He will serve a minimum of 19 years before he can even be considered for parole. Given the nature of his crime and his ongoing mental health issues, it is possible he will never be released. Following the sentencing, the Bush family released a statement. They expressed relief at the verdict and sentence. "As a family, we are relieved to hear today's verdict of murder," they said. They thanked the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the prosecution barristers for their work and support over the 11 months since Will's death. But their statement also made clear that no sentence could truly bring justice for what they had lost. Whilst we recognize that Dylan Thomas' sentence of life in prison with a minimum of 19 years, imprisonment won't bring William back, we do hope that this outcome goes some way to allowing the family to grieve and help in some way with their heartbreak. Detective Constable Joanne Harris, the officer in the case, also released a statement. "William Bush was a much-loved son, brother and boyfriend with a bright future ahead of him, which included moving in with his girlfriend and starting a new job. On the 24th of December 2023, As he looked forward to spending Christmas with his family and girlfriend, he was killed by someone he regarded as his friend, having done nothing to warrant the brutal violence inflicted upon him. She thanked the community of Llandaff for their support during the investigation, praised the emergency service colleagues who tried to help Will, and expressed gratitude to the expert witnesses who provided evidence in the case. This case raises profound questions that extend far beyond the specifics of what happened on Chapel Street on Christmas Eve 2023. First, there is the question of missed opportunities. Dylan Thomas had exhibited clear signs of serious mental illness for at least 6 months before he killed his friend. He had attempted to break into Buckingham Palace with delusional explanations. He had made threats to kill Will. He had experienced hallucinations. Yet he remained untreated, living unsupervised in the community. Dr. Xavier's testimony highlighted that the Buckingham Palace incident should have been a red flag. A young man climbing the palace gates and explaining it by reference to energy fields should have prompted a psychiatric evaluation and intervention. Instead, Dylan was arrested, processed through the criminal justice system, and released. Would treatment at that point have prevented Will's death? We cannot know for certain, but it is a haunting possibility. Second, there is the question of how we balance mental illness with criminal responsibility. The jury in this case decided that Dylan Thomas was guilty of murder despite his schizophrenia. They found that his mental illness, while real and severe, did not diminish his responsibility for his actions to the point where manslaughter was the appropriate charge. This is a difficult judgment that juries must make in cases involving mentally ill defendants. Some may disagree with the jury's verdict. They may feel that anyone suffering from such severe psychosis cannot truly be held fully responsible for their actions. Others will agree with the verdict, noting that Dylan showed planning, that he knew what he was doing was wrong, as evidenced by his lies to police afterward, and that mental illness does not automatically negate criminal responsibility. The law tries to strike a balance. It recognizes that some mental illnesses can substantially impair a person's mental responsibility. That's why the defense of diminished responsibility exists. But it also recognizes that many people with mental illness, even severe mental illness, retain the capacity to understand their actions and make choices. The question is always, in this specific case, with this specific defendant, at this specific time, was their mental state such that they could not form the intent required for murder? In Dylan Thomas's case, the jury answered no. They found that despite his schizophrenia, he could and did form the intent to kill William Bush. Third, there is the broader question of mental health services and support. Dr. Xavier testified about how Dylan's articulate nature and appearance may have led clinicians to miss the severity of his condition. This speaks to a larger issue in mental health care. Severe mental illness does not always look the way we expect it to. A young man from a wealthy background, well-spoken and well-dressed, can still be profoundly unwell. There is also the sad reality that Dylan's family, while materially wealthy, was emotionally distant. By multiple accounts, Dylan felt deserted by his family. He was lonely and isolated, with Will as essentially his only real friend. This combination of mental illness, isolation, and lack of family support created a dangerous situation. The murder of William Bush sent shockwaves through the community of Llandaff. This is a historic, quiet suburb of Cardiff, home to the famous Llandaff Cathedral. It is not a place where people expect to hear screams of horror on Christmas Eve morning. It is not a place where neighbors expect to witness a young man being stabbed to death outside his home. The community rallied around the Bush family and cooperated with the police investigation. Detective Constable Harris specifically thanked the community of Llandaff for their support. But the trauma of such an event ripples outward. The witnesses who heard Will's screams will carry that memory. The emergency responders who tried to save him will carry that memory. Sharon Burton, who tried to perform CPR on a young man her own grandson had just killed, will carry that trauma for the rest of her life. In cases like this, there is a risk that the victim becomes lost in the narrative. The focus shifts to the defendant, the trial, the psychiatric evaluations, the legal arguments. But as Will's father said so powerfully, Will is the main victim here. William Bush was 23 years old. He was a son, a brother, a boyfriend, a friend. He was talented, witty, caring, and loyal. He loved golf and played for his country. He had overcome setbacks and was building a future. He was planning to move in with the woman he loved and start a new job that would be less stressful and more fulfilling. He should have spent Christmas Eve 2023 with his family in Brecon. He should have had decades ahead of him. He should have had the chance to marry Ella, to pursue his career, to play more golf with his brother, to make his parents proud, to live. Instead, his life was ended in 7 minutes of horror by someone he trusted, someone he considered his best friend, someone he had known since he was 13 years old. The Bush family will never recover from this loss. They will mark every Christmas for the rest of their lives by the absence of Will. They will think of what he might have been doing if he had lived. They will be haunted, as his sister said, by the horror of what he endured in his final moments. This is the true cost of this crime. Not the legal proceedings, not the psychiatric debates, but the extinguishing of a bright young life and the lifelong suffering inflicted on everyone who loved Will. As we reflect on this case, we must remember Will first. We must honor his memory by saying his name, by acknowledging his worth, by recognizing that he was more than just a victim in a criminal case. He was a whole person with hopes, dreams, talents, and people who loved him deeply. William Bush, age 23, golfer, surveyor, son, brother, boyfriend, friend, gone too soon, taken senselessly, but not forgotten. As of January 2025, Dylan Thomas is serving his life sentence. He remains in custody, likely still at Ashworth High Secure Hospital or a similar facility, receiving ongoing treatment for his schizophrenia. He will be eligible for parole consideration after serving his minimum term of 19 years, which would be in the year 2044, when he will be 44 years old. Whether he will ever actually be released is uncertain. Parole boards consider many factors, including the nature of the original offense, the behavior of the prisoner while incarcerated, ongoing mental health issues, and the risk to public safety. Given that Dylan killed his best friend in an unprovoked attack and has shown no remorse, and given his ongoing serious mental illness, release may never be deemed appropriate. The Bush family continues to grieve. They have asked for privacy as they try to rebuild their lives without Will. The trauma of this case will be with them forever. The wider community has been left to process this tragedy and to ask difficult questions about mental health, friendship, warning signs, and how such horrors might be prevented in the future. One thing is certain: the name William Bush deserves to be remembered not primarily as the victim in a murder case, but as the vibrant, talented, loving young man he was. His life mattered. His loss is profound. And his memory should be honored. The case of Dylan Thomas and William Bush is a tragedy in the truest sense of the word. It involves the loss of a promising young life, the destruction of multiple families, and questions about mental illness, responsibility, and whether this could have been prevented. There are no easy answers. Mental illness is complex. The line between criminal responsibility and diminished capacity is not always clear. The warning signs that seem obvious in hindsight are often ambiguous in the moment. What is clear is that William Bush deserved better. He deserved to live. He deserved to fulfill his potential. He deserved to grow old with Ella, to continue making his family laugh, to play golf with his brother, to build the life he was working toward. Instead, on Christmas Eve 2023, in a house on Chapel Street in Llandaff, Wales, all of that was taken away in an act of shocking violence by someone he called his best friend. May William Bush rest in peace. May his family find some measure of healing, though the wound will never fully close. And may we all learn from this tragedy to take mental illness seriously, to heed warning signs, to intervene when we see someone in crisis, and to remember that behind every criminal case are real people with real lives that matter. This is the story of William Bush and Dylan Thomas. It is a story of friendship turned deadly, of mental illness gone untreated, of a Christmas Eve that became a nightmare, and of a young man whose bright light was extinguished far too soon. Remember William Bush. Remember what was lost. Remember that every life has value, and every death diminishes us all.